So this week we will be discussing the idea of sin and temptation, and looking at a Gemara that has, at first glance, an approach that we wouldn't expect. And basically the question that I want to ask is, should a person put himself in a situation of sin, of potential sin, of temptation? And what is the Jewish approach to that? Because on the one hand, you would say, well, we have all these ideas of asus siag laTorah, and all these extra prohibitions and all these chumras, in order to prevent ourselves from even coming close to getting to any sort of sin, we tack on all these other things to make sure that we are completely removed. And so, on the one hand, I would say that I shouldn't go to a place where there's potential for sin. But on the other hand, how can I ever get reward, or schar, if I'm never in a position of sin, of being tempted? Now, how can I ever grow? How can I ever defeat the Yetzer Hara? And how can I ever get rewarded for doing something if I'm never in a position where I could have failed to begin with? And so there's kind of this interesting tension where on the one hand we'd want to be in situations where we can overcome the sin, but since there's no guarantee, we're always afraid of being put in that situation. And so we'll try to draw some important distinctions between when the weight falls on one side of that argument versus the other. And we'll use our Gemara coupled with a few others to try to understand when each of those two arguments is more likely to apply. So without further ado, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet. We're still in Perek Aleph of Avodah Zarah, and a large chunk of Perek Aleph is actually Agadata. But we're nearing the end of the Agadic sections of Perek Aleph. So the Gemara says as follows. This is actually right after the context of a halachic discussion of how far away a person has to stay from a Beit Zonot, from a harem, or from a whorehouse. So I believe it's Rav Chisda says that you have to stay Arba Amot, or you can't go within Arba Amot of a Beit Zonot. Whereas Rav Pedat says that this idea of Arba Amot only applies when it comes to Erva, because the Torah says by Erva lo tikurvu, right? And you can't come close. And the idea of you can't come close means not just that you can't touch, but you can't come even within 4 Amot. So if Pedat says that applies by all the Arayos, and everybody agrees to that. But when it comes to something like a zona, so it's not a rayot, it's just forbidden. So there Rav Chisda says no, there's an extra. Even there's this chumrah of dalad amot, whereas Rav Pedat says no, it's just the prohibition of actually touching. So on the back of that discussion, the Gemara says as follows: Rav Chanina Rav Yonatan havu ka'azle be'orcha. Okay, so these two rabbis were just walking along the way. They were going on their way. Matu lehano trei shvile. They reached a crossroads. Chad patzei apitcha devara kachavim, v'chad patzei apitcha debezonot. So they reach a crossroads. If they go one way, they pass by a house of Avodah Zarah, right, an idol worship. If they go the other way, they pass by a Beit Zonot, a whorehouse. So Amar lechad lechavrei. So one of the rabbis says to the other, which one should we? We have to go one way or the other. Which one should we choose? So nizil apitcha devoda kachavim denechis yatzrei. So he says we should go along the road that passes by the house of Avodah Zarah. Why? Because we all know that the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah has been vanquished or severely diminished. There's a famous story in the Gemara in Sanhedrin about how the rabbis came and they prayed, and then the Yetzer Hara appeared like this raging animal, and they killed it, and then they tried to do the same thing with the rayos, but then no chickens were laying eggs, and they realized the world needed sexual desire, and so they just blinded it and sent it free. But Avodah Zarah, they actually destroyed, and they vanquished it. So one rabbi says to his friend, so we have to choose between the Beit Zonot and the Beit Avodah Zarah. It's obvious. We should go to the Beit Avodah Zarah because there's no temptation there. The Beit Zonot, there is a temptation. Amar le idach, the other rabbi says back to him, Nizel apitcha de Beit Zonot, ונכפייה ליצרין ונקבל אגרא. The other rabbi says to him, no, that's exactly why we should go to the other way. We should go pass by the Beit Zonot so that we can conquer our Yetzer Hara and receive reward for having been tempted. So that's the second rabbi's opinion. Kimatu hatam chazinhu lezonot itkanu mikamayu. So when they actually went, they did what the second rabbi said. They went to the path of the Beit Zonot, and when they actually got there, they saw that the zonot were withdrawing from them. They weren't enticing them or trying to seduce them. They stayed in their in their kubot, in their where they lived. So Amar le Menalach, so the first rabbi said to the second rabbi, how'd you know? No, how'd you know that we wouldn't actually be tempted and that we would just receive reward? But how did you know that we wouldn't be in a position where we would succumb? So Amar le, he said to him, there's a pasuk in Mishlei, Mizima tishmor alecha tvuna tinsarecha. And we'll see what that means in just one shortly. Amar le Rabbanan l'Rava. The rabbi said to Rava, my mizima. The pasuk opens, it says mizima, which means from zima, tishmor alecha, right? Something feminine will guard you, and tvuna, which is wisdom, will watch over you. So they say, what does it mean mizima? So ilema Torah dichtiv ba zima. So if you say that it's a reference to Torah, because Torah is referred to as zima, okay, so it says the Torah is sometimes referred to as zima. So yachi zima mi baile. If the reference for zima is Torah, so it shouldn't have said mizima tishmor alecha. It should have said zima tishmor alecha. It should say Torah tishmor alecha, tevuna tinsarecha, and then I would have had the parallel, the first half of the pasuk and the second half of the pasuk. But it doesn't say that. It says mizima, from zima, indicating zima is something bad. So achikamar, this is what it means to say midvar zima tishmor alecha Torah tinsarecha. That zima we know means lewdness or sexual impropriety. So mizima, from lewdness, and then kind of in brackets Torah tishmor alecha. That Torah should protect you from it, and the Torah is not explicitly mentioned in the pasuk, but it's what's being alluded to by tefuna and by the descriptive word tishmor. And so that was the teaching that the second rabbi understood when it says Torah will protect you from zima. And so since these two Talmidei Chachamim were walking along the road, the one wasn't afraid of succumbing to Yetzer Hara. He knew that the zonot would not actually come out and entice them, because he knew that Torah protects, and when Torah protects them from zima, from lewdness. So that's how the rabbi knew, and that's why he brings that pasuk as a proof. Okay, so I hope the way I framed this initially kind of helps us understand the question here of what these two rabbis are actually arguing about. Right? When you have this situation of going to a place where there's a very grave sin, but there's no temptation, or a place where there's another grave sin and there is a great temptation, which one should you do? And the two rabbis basically argue about it. And the second one ends up winning. Right? He is, not only do they do what he says, but he ends up being vindicated in the end. And the question is, well, how does that make sense based on all the things that we know about how we shouldn't put ourselves in a position of temptation? So this is the Marasha this is a question that the Marasha raises. But before we read the Marasha, we have to learn the Gemara in Sukkah.
One sec, Ron, question.
Yeah.
I thought the whole point was they went to the brothel, right, so that they could be tempted ki'ilu and overcome a temptation, right? But when they got there, none of the inhabitants came out to try and entice them, right? So they kind of couldn't have been tempted anyway to overcome the temptation. See what I mean? Yeah. I guess they still get schar for even going there to begin with, even though the Zona didn't actually come out to try to tempt them. But I hear your question. It's yeah. I don't know. I don't really have a good answer, but I think the idea is that that we should go there, we conquer evil inclination and get reward. So they didn't even have to conquer their inclination, but they still get a reward for going there. I think that's how I would understand it. And then the other rabbi says, how'd you know that we'd get reward and not even be tempted to begin with? And that's because Torah protects. But I agree with you that it's not, what ends up happening is not exactly the way that they had described the reason behind going there to begin with. So I'm not sure. Good question. Okay, so the Gemara in Sukkah on Daf Nun Bet Amud Bet says as follows: Amar Abaye. It's talking about the Yetzer Hara there. This is a section of all these different
sayings about the Yetzer Hara, which I brought a few of them here, but we'll probably skip them. But in particular, Abai says, Amar Abai v'talmidei chachamim yoter mikulam, that the Yetzer Hara is even stronger by talmidei chachamim compared to everybody else. Ki hade Abai shamei lehu gavra, dekamar lehi itetan nakdeim v'nezil beorcha. One time Abai heard some guy saying to some woman, oh, let's go, I'll escort you, let's go along the road together. Amar, Abai said, Izel ifrashinhu mi isura. So Abai said, I'll trail them, and I'll make sure that they don't do anything sinful. And I guess this was a situation where the man and the woman, if they did anything, it would be an isur. So Abai says, I'll follow them, and I'll make sure that they don't get tempted, that they don't actually commit any sin. Azal batraihu talata parse be'agma. He followed them for 3 parsaot, which is a very far distance, like in the meadows. Kihavu parshe, and then it got to a point where the man and woman needed to part ways, mehadade, right, that they had to go their separate ways. Chaminu, so Abai heard the ka'amre, they said, orchin achika v'tzavtin b'sima. Basically, they said, like, the road is long, and it's been nice kind of walking with you, but the time has come for us to part ways. And then they did in fact go their separate ways. Amar Abai said, in man desani li hava lo hava matze le'okme nafshe. Abai basically says, he's standing there and he says, if I had been in the situation of that man, I would not have been able to resist or restrain myself. Azal tla nafshe be'ibura dedasha u'mitzta'er. So he went and he leaned against kind of the doorpost, and he was in a state of agony. Like, he was in a state of agony that he suspected this man, that he followed this man. In the end, the man was innocent, and Abai realized that he would have done something that this man that he was trying to protect wouldn't have done. And so he didn't know how to deal with that. He was stressed out about it. Ata hu saba, then some old man came along, and taught Abai kol gadol mechavero yitzor gadol himenu. Whoever's greater than his fellow also has a greater Yetzer Hara. So that was meant to appease Abai, that Abai shouldn't feel bad that his Yetzer Hara is stronger than the Yetzer Hara of this person, because Abai was greater than him. So that's the Gemara in Sukkah. So Maharshal comes and says, Ein ze soter ma shekatuv perek Chalil de Abai hava mitztayer ve'amar al atzmo iman desani lehava lo haya matzeh lok menafshe adetani lahu saba kol gadol mechaver yitzor gadol himenu. So Maharsha says, initially you might think that our Gemara about Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yonatan contradicts the Gemara about Abaye. Why would you think that? Why do these two potentially conflict with one another? Thoughts?
Because they're talking about, in the first Gemara, talking about putting yourself in a place where you need to overcome your Yetzer, and here he's dafka going to protect them against their Yetzer. No,
right. In other words, yeah, like you shouldn't put. Abai says, like, if I had been in that situation, I would have succumbed. Like, you shouldn't. Abai clearly thought that a person should not put himself in the situation where he'd be tempted to sin. Abai thought it was bad that this man was accompanying this woman for such a long distance, because then they'd be in a position where sin could occur. And Abai was trying to prevent that, thought that was not a good thing, which seems to contradict the potential message of our Gemara, where it says, no, dafka, go down the road to the Beis Zonot, because Torah will protect you, and then you'll get reward, but it could potentially be a situation where you'd sin, but you should still go and do it. So Maharsha says those two don't contradict each other. Why? Because there's a distinction between the two cases. De'acha ayir b'shah shosek b'torah k'pirashi mizima tishmor alecha mikol davara v'hir hochet v'anu holchin haloch v'daber b'divrei Torah. That basically the way Rashi explains it is that these rabbis they were talking Torah. So the reason they weren't afraid was because the pasuk of Mishlei says that Torah will protect you from being tempted to sin. If you're conversing in Torah, then you won't fall prey to Yetzer Hara. And so that's different from this story over here, where this man was just accompanying this woman. It's not as though he was talking Torah. So Torah protects, and if you don't have Torah, then the pasuk in Mishnah doesn't apply, and then you shouldn't go and put yourself in a situation where sin is possible.
Isn't that also a problem of Marasayan in the first Gemara?
Yeah, good. It's strange to think of these two, right, Gedolim, like specifically going to a house, the Beit Zona. The Gemara doesn't seem to touch on that at all. Like how can they go to a brothel just because of what people would think? It's a good question. I thought about that too, and I tried to find in the Mefarshim anyone who, I didn't, from like the very cursory view I didn't see anyone who addresses that. But it's an obvious question. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the whole Gemara is very strange, right? Like, I mean, I should actually mention, this is Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet. There's a very famous story on this daf that is also in the Ein Yaakov that I skipped. That's the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya. So I assume you guys have heard it, but it's the one of the guy who he would pay any amount to go. Like he slept with every zona in the land, right? He made sure to go and satisfy himself with all of them. Right, you guys familiar with the story? And then there was this one zona, it was like the most famous one of all, and she demanded a very high price. He went and he paid her, and then he went really far distance, and he did all this stuff to get to her. And then as they're in the middle of their action, he passes wind, and she says to him, just like the wind that you just passed will never return, so too you will never be able to return. It's this kind of idea that the zona is telling this Elazar ben Dodaya that there's no way for him to do tshuva. And then he has this like moment where he goes and he says to the mountains, can you be my witnesses and help me do tshuva? And the mountains say no. And he goes to the sky, and the sky says no. He goes to the stars say no. And he says, Ena davar talui ela bi, right? I'm the only one who can effect tshuva for myself. He puts his head between his knees and he cries until his soul departs. He's so agonized over the state that he'd gotten to, where he was just all about the physical pleasure. And the Gemara says that the Bat Kol came out and said that, called him a Rebbe Elazar ben Dodai, and said that he had a place in Olam Haba. The story ends where Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says there's some people who get Olam Haba after only a lifetime of effort, and some people get Olam Haba just in an instant. Right? This rabbi got in an instant. So, that Gemara it's a very famous Gemara, and it's like a whole topic in of itself. But it's also kind of discussing this world of rabbis or people that are just frequenting these brothels. In that story, it was before he was a Rebbe that he was going, so maybe it's not as strange, but there's obviously kind of also this thematic thing of like rabbis visiting brothels.
No, Tom. You need to eat more.
Sorry? Chaim, I see you asked were brothels common. I don't know. I assume like in any society. But I mean, it's clear from this story, at least, that it was something that was around, right? Wherever Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yonatan lived, that they, I think in Eretz Yisrael, that it was there, and that they knew it was there. But I don't know how common they were. But back to Simon's question, it's a good one. Like, why are these rabbis not concerned about Ayin Hara? So let's just finish the Maharsha. The Maharsha also says, "Ve'od dehatam yachid hava." The Maharsha says it's kind of like with Tosfos, where he has two sugyas that contradict, and you try to describe, give an explanation why they're different from one another, and so it's not a question. So the Maharsha says that the reason why the story of Abaye and this story are different. So one answer you can give is that they're learning Torah. So when you're learning Torah, you can put yourself in a situation of potential temptation, whereas if you're not learning Torah, you cannot, because Torah protects. But another potential chiluk that can be made is dehatam yachid hava, and this one is pretty practical. It actually makes a lot of sense. The story in Avodah Zarah, it's two rabbis, so there's two people there. So each of them has the other one to keep them in check and to make them have social pressure not to do something. Whereas in the story of the man who went off for 3 parsot through the meadows with the woman, he was alone, or they were alone. So obviously, for practical reasons, that's something you shouldn't do, because then you're by yourself. Versus if you have another person who's with you, especially a Talmid Chacham,
So then maybe there's more room to say that you can put yourself in a situation where you can conquer Yetzer Hara and receive reward. That's what the Maharsha suggests. I want to read a couple of Gemaras that you've probably heard, but kind of jumped to mind when I learned this sugya. Who is probably the best example of somebody who actively asked to be tempted in the realm of sexual immorality and failed? Right, that tried to conquer his Yetzer Hara and failed, and actively sought it out. Like, what is the classic example of that? So the answer is that the Gemara in Sanhedrin and Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph attributes that to David HaMelech, the story of Bathsheba. Harav Yudah Amarav, La'olam al yavi adam atzmo lidei nisayon, shari David Melech Yisrael yavi atzmo lidei nisayon v'nichshal. A person should never bring himself to a situation of being tested. It's best not to be tested, even if you won't receive a reward. It's best not to be tested. Don't ever put yourself in a situation proactively where you're going to be tested. Because David did that, and he failed. So David HaMelech says, why do they say you are the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? They don't say you're the God of David. So Amar, God said, Inu min suli v'at lo min sitli. God says, I tested Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. You have not been tested. Amar lefanav Ribono shel olam, b'chaneni v'naseini, shneimar b'chaneni Hashem v'naseini v'gomer. So David says, great, so test me. Amar, God says to him, min sanalach, I will test you. V'avidna milta b'hadach tiladidhu lo hodatinhu v'ilu ana ka modana lach de minsina lecha b'dvar erva. So God says to David, okay, you want to be tested, I'll test you. Not only that, I'll give you a leg up. Where with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, I didn't tell them what their test would be. But with you, I'll tell you that your test has something to do with the Dvar Erva. It's going to be something in the realm of sexual immorality and forbidden relationships. Miyad, right after that, what happens? The story of Bathsheba happens right after that. Amar of Yehuda, she'afach mishkavo shel laila lemishkavo shel yom. That David HaMelech would go to sleep during the day and stay up all night so that he wouldn't be tempted. Because if he's if he's in bed during the day, so everybody's around, so he's not going to be tempted to commit a sin. But he forgot about the halacha. Ever katan yesh ba'adam masbi'o ra'ev u'marivo savea. It's interesting that this is described as a halacha. I'm not really sure why. It says a man has a small limb, which is referring here to a person's private. Masbi'o ra'ev, the more a man feeds it, the hungrier it is. U'marivo savea, but the more a man starves it, the more satisfied it is. In other words, the more a person has sex, the more they want it. And the more they restrain themselves and stay chaste, then the desire gets more muted. So David apparently forgot about that because he was still having a lot of sex during the day. And so Bathsheba, he was not able to withstand his temptation. So there's kind of a question, why is this not a contradiction to the Gemara that we saw in Avodah Zarah and Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet? Because over there we saw the rabbis go and say, let's go to the Beit Zonot to be tempted to conquer Yetzer Hara and receive reward. And David ostensibly does something similar, where he says to God, I want you to test me so that I can receive a reward and you can be referred to as Okay David. But David fails, and we learn from that a person should never do that. But what about the story in Avodah Zarah? So, I'd like to suggest that the Mefarshim that I saw didn't actually mention this Gemara, which surprised me, but I'd like to suggest that the difference here, of course, and this is a major one, is that the story in Avodah Zarah, the rabbis are not actively going and saying we want to be tested, it's not as though they're sitting at home and they say let's go to the Beit Zonot to conquer our inclination. That the situation there is that they're stuck at a crossroads and they have to choose between the lesser of two evils. They have to choose between the house of Avodah Zarah or the Beit Zonot. So when you're in a situation that you're already stuck and it's a b'diavad situation where you have to test yourself somehow in a situation of a very severe sin, so then there may be room to say you should go to the place where, if you're already in that situation, to conquer your Yetzer Hara. But just stomp to out of the blue go and try to tempt your Yetzer Hara by putting yourself in a situation of sin, that a person should not do. And that's perhaps why the story of David is not a problem for the story of Avodah Zarah, because David goes to God and says, tempt me with some test, and God says, I'll tempt you with a sexual sin, and then David fails. Because it's not as though David was kind of stuck in a situation already where he had to choose between that and Avodah Zarah, versus the rabbis here. Even though Rabbi Yonatan learned from this pasuk in Mishlei that the Torah protects you from zima, so it doesn't necessarily extend to actually going and actively putting yourself in a situation of zima when there's no reason to. Right? It just means it'll protect you if you're stuck, and if you're in a scenario where the zima is there and it's coming to get you, so Torah will protect you when you're there, not in an ideal scenario. So that's I think a pretty logical chiluk to draw between the story of David, the story in Avodah Zarah. I just want to conclude with the Gemara in Yoma Daf Chaf Ben Amud Bet, which further talks about what happened to David. This is David b'shtayim ma'ninhu. So it says David HaMelech actually sinned twice. Once the Uriah, that he had Uriah killed on the battlefield. So he had an innocent man murdered. The Hasata, and the story at the end of Shmuel Bet, where he has Bnei Israel counted, and that leads to this plague coming and killing a lot of the people. The Gemara says, you're telling me that he had two sins, that he had Uriah killed and that he counted the people and it led to this plague. What about the story of Bathsheba? Isn't that the most obvious sin of David? No, we're only talking in this context about sins that David was not actually punished for by Olam Hazeh. And the story of Bathsheba, David was punished for. Dichtiv, the pasuk says, "V'takifsai shalem arbatayim." Right, when Natan Navi comes to David after the sin of Bathsheba, Natan gives him this whole mashal of a man who's poor and has a sheep, and and the rich man comes and steals the sheep, and David says, the person who stole the poor man's sheep should have to pay fourfold, which is the halacha. You have to pay 4 times. And so then Natan says, you are that man because you stole Bathsheba from Uriah and you have all these other wives, etc., etc. And so the Gemara actually learns from there that he actually was punished based on his own proclamation that in that scenario a person should pay fourfold. So he was actually punished with the deaths of 4 of his children, 4 of his sheep, as it were. Yeled, the child whose name was not named, the one who was the product of David and Bathsheba's first illicit relationship, and who dies. And then David also sees the death of Amnon, sees the death of Avshalom, and Tamar, who doesn't die necessarily, but she is defiled by Amnon, so it's as though she was dead. So he loses 4 children in a sense. So he was punished for the sin of Bathsheba. That's why it's not a problem by saying that David was sinned and went and did not receive punishment for 2 things. So the Gemara continues, Hatanami parumine. But what do you mean? He also received punishment for those other things. Dichtiv, Vayten Hashem dever ba'am min haboker va'et moed. The story of the Hasatah. So God does punish David. He goes and he sends a plague. David committed a sin by counting the people, and Hashem punished by sending a plague that killed other people. So why are you telling me that, the reason why Bathsheba is not in the list is because Bathsheba was punished, or the reason why Hasatah is in the list is because Hasatah was not punished? What do you mean Hasatah was punished? And the Gemara says, Hatam la ipra'u migufei. No, the difference is that when it came to the Hasatah, David himself was not affected. It's true that this plague went and killed everybody, but David's body was not affected, versus Bathsheba, where David's body was affected. And the Gemara says, what do you mean? Hatanami lo ipra'u migufei. David wasn't affected himself either. His children died, but he wasn't affected. So, la ipra'u migufei. The Amar of Yudah Marav, Shisha chodashim tztar David u'parshu amenu sanhedrin v'nistakam amenu shchina v'chtiv vashuvu li yirecha v'yadei yadetach v'chtiv vashiv li shizon ishecha. And basically, there's a teaching of Rav that David HaMelech actually got tzlarat for 6 months, and that the Shekhinah departed from him, and the Sanhedrin would not meet him or be in his presence. So David his body was actually punished for the sin of Bathsheba. So when all the dust settles, we see that the story of David over here
is the story of him being tempted and him failing and him being punished for that failure. But that there's reasons to draw a distinction between this type of scenario where a person actively tries to put himself in the situation of sin, which is forbidden, and a scenario where when you're already in the case where you have to go one way or the other, you should pick the one already where you're perhaps more likely to receive a reward. And even within that, you shouldn't do it unless you are, as the Maharsha says, either in company and you're not by yourself. If you're by yourself, you probably shouldn't do it. And you should only do it if you're talking words of Torah. Ad kan.
Shkoyach.